Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the last 5 pieces of nonfiction that I read. So the first of the books that I picked up was Adam Pottle's Voice on Writing with Deafness. This is part memoir and part summary of writing process. And as you can see from this is quite short. So in 151 pages, to get through both of those things, you can guess that you probably won't get a lot of depth in this necessarily. That hadn't scared me off from this because I have talked about a couple of Adam Pottle's works already this year. In, I believe, one of my short novels videos, I talked about his novella The Bus, which I thought was a masterwork. I thought it was brilliant. And I read his poetry collection, Beautiful Mutants, last month and talked about that in one of my National Poetry Month videos. So I kind of trusted in his ability to make the short format work for him. Now, to be fair, I saw him speak on a panel at the Festival of Literary Diversity a couple of weeks ago, and some of the comments that he makes in here, and especially a couple of the jokes he made on that panel, and one of them in particular was a little eye-rolly as a joke, and I think if I'd seen it once that would have been fine, but because I saw it on the panel and again in the book, I kind of groaned a little bit. It does talk about his writing process, and he does specifically talk about writing The Bus and how it evolved from a slightly different project that he worked on earlier in his career. And he talks quite a bit about the work that he did on the play Ultrasound. And that was really interesting because he talks a lot about the translation bits in that. Because he is lowercase d deaf, he was raised in the oralist style speaking, and he has learned to sign as an adult, but wasn't raised in that uppercase D deaf culture. So when he wrote that play, it had to be translated. And a lot of that experience was really interesting. So I enjoyed both the peek into the writing of that novella and the writing and then translation of the play. The issue that I had here is that the framing structure is basically the author talking to a dead musician, and it just doesn't quite work. I thought those were the weakest parts whenever he goes back to those sections which are presented in italics. I kind of groaned a little bit because the childhood memoir bits were interesting. Basically about how his love for writing came from basically watching TV with closed captioning in part, which was all really interesting stuff, but the framing device just didn't really work for me. So I enjoyed reading this. I think it's funny that he does identify as lowercase d deaf and they have voice fingerspelled on the cover, but whatever. I enjoyed reading it, and I enjoyed having a look into, as I said, this novel that I really loved and this play that I remember reading about that I've never seen, but the reactions to it was something that caused a lot of think pieces. Anyway, so I thought it was worth reading, but it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be based on the other things that I've read from him. So next up, I thought it was about time that I read something a little less modern, and I read As I Crossed a Bridge of Dream, Reflections of a Woman in 11th-Century Japan. The author of this is sometimes called Lady Sarashina. She's occasionally known as her father's daughter, but her actual given name isn't known, which is interesting considering that her poetry and travel writing essentially has survived for 1,000 years. This is an interesting look at the life of an upper middle class woman who married relatively late and had enough leisure time to write in, as it says, 11th century Japan. So if you want to look at what the life of someone who is not royalty or anything, but still comfortable enough to be in a position to do a lot of reading and do a lot of writing, but 1,000 years ago. This is a really interesting peek into that. This is a translation that was originally done in the 70s by Ivan Morris, and it includes illustrations that were originally done in the 1700s. So it's an interesting historical package. I think this was interesting more as a curiosity than necessarily as a piece of writing, but at the same time I think there are other translations of this that are maybe more poetic, and maybe it's more poetic in Japanese. I thought this was definitely worth picking up if you're a fan of travel writing, which I generally am, and want to see that kind of thing, except it's 1,000 years ago. So it's kind of exciting. This is really interesting stuff. I don't have a lot to say because it did feel pretty straightforward to me, and again, I don't know how much of that is the translation, but it was definitely really interesting to read. Next up, I read something that is very modern and very depressing, and that is No Friend But the Mountain by Behrouz Boochani. These are his writings from an Australian-run prison camp for refugee claimants in Papua New Guinea. The author of this had the misfortune of arriving in Australia days after they made this really horrific law and sent refugees to this camp. And it's just a really raw look at things that were happening there over the course of several years. The whole situation is so horrific that it's hard to separate out the content from the actual writing. Boochani is a journalist. He writes for The Guardian. He wrote almost all of this on a cell phone, which he sent to people who then translated it and produced it as a book like this. But as a journalist, he is kind of the ideal person to be writing something like this, but it is not pure journalistic writing. It also includes a lot of poetry, which is interesting, although I feel like from an audience point of view, I don't know if that would alienate readers who would be more drawn to traditional journalistic writing or traditional memoir. And I will say, because the context matters so much with this one, there is a really extensive introduction and really extensive notes from the translator. And the translator, Omid Tofighian, writes quite a bit in the back, both about how the translation happened, about kind of the external situation surrounding publication, and how getting cell phones in and out and getting the messages in and out worked, and also about the power structures involved in how he translated things, which was really interesting. So I thought this was incredibly worthwhile. Yeah, it's just a horrific thing to read and think about how poorly people treat other people. I think one of the comments that I saw come up in some of the reviews that I looked at when I saw it on Goodreads is that he doesn't mention why he became a refugee, and I think the fact that he's a Kurdish journalist from Iran probably answers the question on its own, but I think it's more powerful that way just because that's maybe not what matters. That's not the story that this is telling, so that's just kind of an aside there. But yeah, this was definitely worth picking up and worth taking a look at. Alright, while we're talking about political acts, I also finished Don't Label Me by Irshad Manji. Subheading here is an incredible conversation for divided times, which overpromises. The framing here is that she's talking to her dog about conversations and about how right-wing and left-wing people don't talk to each other, basically. She's been living in the United States for a number of years, and this is clearly aimed at an American audience. Reading it, there's a lot of this country, and it clearly means the United States. I'm not actually sure if she's become a US citizen, but she does definitely live there permanently now. Her wife is American. And the title of this comes from the fact that when she first started working in the US and was basically a talking head on a lot of political chat shows, she was basically the token brown Canadian Muslim lesbian woman. And then she would say things that were either in line with what you would expect a person of her demographic categories to be, or you would sit back and be shocked because it wasn't. And she had us a lot of like pro-military feelings, some of which she's changed. She talks about this. In the early 2000s, she was very supportive of US military intervention in a number of countries that, you know, I think a lot of people in Canada went, what happened to her? Because they remember her as someone who'd been a talking head on TV Ontario, and prior to that, the host of Queer Television on City TV, which in here she talks about. Apparently that was the first TV show of its kind in the world. It was basically a queer-focused news show that was... Anyway, so that was interesting. And then she moved to the US and was so into some of these, like I said, military intervention stuff. Anyway, at some point she basically had a breakdown because she was on these shows basically to argue political points as the kind of, I don't know, militarily conservative and socially liberal person, sort of, except she's like fairly religious, but still makes generalization. There's a lot of dog stuff because this is framed in talking to her dog. And so when she opens with, ooh, dogs are evil, but I have a dog, I'm like, no, dogs are maybe dirty depending on your school of thought. And then the whole book is her having conversations with the dog and then jokes with a lot of puns. And on the one hand, I think there are a lot of conversations that people with opposing political ideas maybe should have with each other as opposed to shouting at each other all the time. That's shouldn't be something that's a shocking idea. But at the same time, it's so bland and it's presented in such a ridiculous way that my takeaway was, you know, okay, but... So I'm still kind of baffled by the way she's gone politically. And again, I appreciate that she's had a lot of hate from a lot of different sides. Her political views kind of clash with each other in the way that we often have expectations for people to fall in line, and as well as the sexuality and religious issues that come up on each other. It's just, there's so many puns. And there are chapters that are then supposed to be written by the dog after the dog has been put to sleep. And it's just, it's so weird. So I don't know who that's for. I don't get it. I don't know, she's doing a speech at one of the libraries here in a couple of weeks, and I almost want to go and see if there's a question and answer period where she explains more about the weird corniness of this. It's weird. And I have a dog. I like dogs. I should like it, but it's terrible. Anyway, I'm just gonna stop babbling about it. Finally, I read The Butchering Art by Lindsey Fitzharris. Andrea from Infinite Text talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I immediately put it on hold because it sounded like a lot of fun. This is half a biography of Joseph Lister, who basically revolutionized British and then from there Western Europe and then North American surgical practices. Basically because he was able to prove that germs were a thing and that you could lower deaths from surgery if people weren't constantly having pus-infected wounds. The weird part about this is that in addition to being a biography of Joseph Lister, it also is a sort of shock value presentation of Victorian era surgical practices. And the two parts are actually written in distinct, very tonally different parts. It reminded me of sometimes when you go to older cities, they'll have something that's almost half stage show, half museum, where you walk through and see like historic torture chambers or something like that. That's kind of what this book is trying to do. And it's funny because sometimes it'll describe the same scenario, but in the biography part it will say that Lister was appalled by hospital instruments that had been fouled with feces and urine. Meanwhile, when they start describing the hospital and talking about dead bodies everywhere, it'll say, it constantly reeked of piss and shit. Okay, those both mean the same thing, but the tonal difference between here's the serious biography and here's the shock value, watch them sawing off limbs. So it's entertaining that way, but I did feel like I was almost reading two books. One that was kind of a, let me try to shock you about Victorian era surgery, and one that is a more serious biography of Joseph Lister. The stuff about Lister I thought was fascinating because I didn't know anything about him. The surgical stuff I found slightly less interesting just because I knew more about that, and I found the tone shift to be a little weird. But I think if you were coming into this not knowing anything about it, I think that would actually make it more compelling. So I don't think that that's really a flaw with the book itself. It's maybe just something that threw my expectations. So yeah, I think that was probably really successful at drawing people into something that maybe they wouldn't realize that they'd be interested in. That was kind of a weird combination of books that I got to reading over the past couple of weeks. But if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And if you've read anything that sounds similar, I'd love to hear about those as well. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.